So, welcome along to a special video version of On Human-Nonhuman Relations Podcast with me, Roger Yates. I have two of my previous guests along with me today, and we're going to try to get to the bottom of a movement issue, which is a strategy for animal liberation, no less. Now, so welcome along, guys. In a sense, I'm gonna assume that neither of you need an introduction, but just in case, Jake Conroy is the Cranky Vegan on YouTube and social media. He was a prime member in the 1990s of the Shack campaign in the US and now is an advocate for a return to some forms, at least, of pressure campaigning, which is probably one of the main things he's going to talk about today. Ronnie Lee, well, Ronnie Lee is Ronnie Lee. So if you don't know who that is, then just Google it because it's all out there. So welcome along. Now, I guess at the present time, you two have a kind of different view of what will achieve animal liberation. And so I'm going to invite you to set out your stall, as it were, and talk to us about what you think is the future emphasis of the movement, what it should be. So we're going to start with Jake. So Jake, could you give us a brief account of pressure campaigning as a general matter, and then probably explain to us, which forms of that do you think are appropriate for the 21st century?
Yeah. First couple things I'd want to say is that these are my ideas, and I don't know if they're right. I don't know if they're wrong. I don't want to give the impression that I know everything and I'm dictating how things should be done. These are just my opinions from my personal experiences. But I think it's important that we have conversations like this because we can start to figure these things out together. I also feel pretty, I hate to say blessed because that's a terrible word, but I do feel kind of blessed to be able to have this conversation with both of you, because I think it's super important that not only do we have these conversations, but we have these conversations with people from different generations of the movement. And I say that respectfully, not point finger at old people in the room. But the fact of the matter is, you've been doing this decades longer than I have, and I've been doing this a decade or two longer than other people. And I think if all these different decades and generations of our movement get together, we learn a whole lot from one another. So I'm really excited that I get to be here with you two. So thank you. I'm a big fan of pressure campaigns. I think ultimately, the people in society are not the problem. I don't think people in society are the ones that are necessarily to blame for what's going on in the world, including what's going on with non-human animals. I think ultimately the system is responsible for that. And a part of that system is corporations and industry creating a society where it normalizes the eating of animals and drinking of their secretions. I think it normalizes the murder of the billions and billions and billions of animals every year. And I think there's the idea that we can change the demand part of supply and demand in order to put pressure on that system. But ultimately, I just don't think in the decades that we've been doing this, that we don't have the numbers or the capability in the grassroots movement, particularly, which is where my heart is, to affect change big enough to shift things in the world that we need to shift. So it's my opinion that we need to put pressure on industries. We need to put pressure on corporations, and we need to put pressure on the people that are running those corporations and have the ability to make those decisions, to change things and start changing and shifting the way that culture exists. I think we do that by putting pressure on the Achilles heel of those people and those corporations that we've done very successfully, that you two have done very successfully in the past. And I think another piece of that is, I think in today's movement, we have respectfully a lack of understanding and difference between the idea of what a tactic is and a strategy is. And I think we see this a lot in the grassroots animal rights movement, who insist that educational outreach is the only way that we're going to achieve animal liberation. And that's the sole strategy to move things forward. But ultimately, education isn't a strategy, it's a tactic. It's a vitally important tactic. You can't have pressure campaigning, successful pressure campaigning, without education. But you also can't have successful pressure campaigning with all the other pieces as well: protests, petitions, emails, civil disobedience, direct action, sabotage. You need all of those things to affect change in this world. And I think when we limit ourselves to just one piece of that puzzle, we end up failing. So for me, I want to see corporate campaigning and pressure campaigning happen a lot more in the grassroots animal rights movement. I think that includes getting to do educational outreach as a very important big piece of that, by talking to people about the campaigns, but also getting to talk to people about the broader issues of veganism and plant-based eating and things like that. And so I think when we start putting all those things together, I think that's when we get to start to see exciting change. And that's the end of the podcast. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, we should have done all that kind of hello everyone bit, shouldn't we? Yeah. So where did that come from, Jake?
Which part, me acting like an idiot, or the things I just
said? The kind of lunging towards the camera at the beginning malarkey.
I don't know. Everyone on YouTube needs some stupid shtick to set themselves apart, and unfortunately, that has become mine. So it's a band that I have to live with.
Yeah, you're kind of stuck with that forever now.
Yeah.
It's typecasting. So Ronnie, if you, in the terms of laying out your stall, so just talk about your emphasis at the moment on vegan education, and then you can move on to responding to what Jake said, okay?
Okay, well, what I want to see, we all want to see, is what I'd refer to as a situation of animal liberation, widespread animal liberation, where animals are no longer subject to tyranny by the human species, or as much as that as we possibly can get. And the question is kind of how do we achieve that? And I don't think that we can achieve that unless a large number of people actually believe in it, unless a large number of people actually want it. So how do you create that situation where a large number of people want it? And I think it's very important in order to do that, to actually educate people to become vegan. Not just becoming vegan in the sense of adopting a plant diet, but becoming vegan in the sense of adopting the philosophy, an animal liberationist philosophy, which would obviously include eating a plant diet. And so that's why I think vegan education is really important. And I'm not naive enough to believe that we're going to educate everybody to go vegan, but we don't need to educate everybody to go vegan. We just need to educate enough people to go vegan in order that we gain we gain political control, really, and so that then everyone has to go vegan because of that. And if we're going to gain that political control, that once again means educating a lot of people to go vegan, because we want those people to vote in the right way. We want those people, we want the right sort of politicians elected that will put in place the right measures to protect animals. So, and that all really goes back to education. We're not going to get that unless enough people are educated to vote the right way, and enough people educate to actually, get involved in politics and support the right policy. So that's why I think education is so important. That doesn't mean that I'm opposed to pressure campaigns. I think pressure campaigns do have a part to play in the whole scenario, but that is why I believe education to be so important.
So what I'm getting from both of you is that you're both kind of in support of all of it, but you want the emphasis to be on one rather than the other. And I saw the primer video that you did recently, Jake. You were saying that we need to kind of decenter veganism and really go for a big increase in the pressure campaign. So you kind of think that at the moment there's no kind of, the balance is all wrong, as it were. Is that right? Would you say that?
Yeah, I think the balance feels off. And again, I want to make it clear that I'm talking about the grassroots animal rights movement. But yeah, I think the balance is off in the grassroots animal rights movement. I think we do a large percentage of educational outreach. And I think if we look at it as like a building that we want to deconstruct or destroy, and that being like, human supremacy or whatever that building wants to be, like, there are multiple pillars that hold that up, right? Finances, greed, capitalism, education or lack thereov. And we need to chop down all those pillars in order to crumble the house, to take the building down. But we're, for the last, I would argue, and I know, Roger, you disagree with me, but I would argue for the last 20, 30 years, we've spent almost our entire time just trying to chop down that one educational pillar. And I think if that's the only one we're hacking away at, I just don't ever see us hacking away enough for it to fall. Even if that does fall, we still have all those other pillars that are still holding up that building. And so I think like pressure campaigning, while it doesn't cover all of those things, I think it does hack away at multiple pillars all at the same time, if it's a big enough push. But I do think it includes that education piece. And I do think it includes getting people on board with eating plant-based diet, getting people on board with veganism. But I think and maybe this is not where we want to drive the conversation quite yet, but I do think that like making veganism that first step before anyone can do anything else is another really big detriment to the animal rights movement's success or ability to create success.
Is the ultimate disagreement here between supply and demand? Then do you think that's where you both see the difference in emphasis should be Jake on the supply side, Ronnie on the demand side? Is that what we're talking about?
Not for me, but
yeah, I mean, obviously, the more people that become vegan, the less demand there is in various ways for animals to be oppressed. I mean, first of all, in terms of the food industry, but in other areas as well, as people change. And I kind of I think the environment is very important in all this, because the very major area of the oppression of other animals is the adverse human impact on the environment. I mean, in terms of the number of animals that suffer and die because of that, that's probably a very close second to the actual consumption of animal products. It's a huge area, and so people trying their best, shall we say, to tread lightly upon the earth and not to impact on the habitats of other animals that's really important. And once again, I think that also is part of what I would call vegan education. Is to educate people to be vegan in a broad sense, not just in terms of their diet. But you see, if we have a different politics, then everything else kind of follows that. If we say had eco-socialism rather than capitalism, then everything else kind of falls into place with that, in terms of industry, in terms of big business, and what all these what they all do. But if we are going, and we do have to radically change the political system if we're going to get animal liberation, it can't. I don't believe animal liberation can be achieved under capitalism. That has to go. In order to do that, we have to change politics. We have to change ordinary people, because it is up to ordinary people as to what politicians we get, what political system we get.
How many people do you think, percentage-wise, and obviously this is like kind of a pie in the sky, hard to answer question, but like what percentage of a population do you think you need in order to start really affecting politics? And maybe not even just in the UK, but China or India. Like what's the percentage of the population do we need to get to adopt a vegan lifestyle that we start shifting the politics in those countries towards a more friendly atmosphere for animals?
I kind of think it depends on the different political systems. What you need if we're going to have, if you're going to have, say, a government in this country that was like really pro animal liberation, pro protecting animals. Well, at the last election here, the government was elected by 30%. 30% of people that were allowed to vote. Not everyone that did vote, because not all of them did, but 30% of the electorate voted for the Conservative Party, who then formed the government. So it's 30%. In the UK, it would be 30%. And I mean, 30% is a lot, but it's not as much as 100%. And I think that the problem all across what we're both saying, really, in terms of whatever sort of action we want people to do, is the problem of the problem of people not being activists. That's the problem. Is that we have a lack of activists, We've got there's been this really big increase in people becoming vegan, but so few of those vegans have become active in spreading the vegan message or in any other type of activism, and that's the fundamental problem. That was the problem for us both. Whatever sort of action we want people to do, there's a huge problem in lack of activists. And I think the other problem, which is perhaps even more serious, is the problem of lack of organisers, because you can have people who want to be active, but if nobody organises those actions, then they're not going to take place. And I think that here in the UK, most actions that take place, whether it's vegan education or other types of action, most of those activities take place in the centre of big cities, and there are so many towns and suburbs of cities where there's no activity, where there's no action, and the reason for that is because nobody there organises it. And so it's vitally important we have more activists, whatever type of action we want people to do. But even more important than that is that we have more people prepared to be organisers. And to me, that kind of really is the key as to whether we achieve animal liberation, because these things will ever only happen unless people make them happen.
Yeah, well, can we focus just on going back to the activist part? Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Jake, but your position is that by decentering veganism, we can get more active. In other words, we've got this interesting thing. I mean, this is something that I really want to explore today, which is the idea, and a few activists talk about this, the idea that we should concentrate on getting activists who then eventually kind of, put all the dots together and become vegan. Whereas it's kind of come about that you've now got a lot of people, as it were, going vegan, and then you've got the problem of making them into activists. So would you say there's a way of creating activists who might then become vegan? So this is what I'm kind of struggling with your position, Jake. I'm struggling that because it seems to me that you're not really going to get any kind of thing going in the 21st century where veganism is not going to be a topic of conversation and focus of anything that gets going. Have I got that right or not?
I think you can get things going that have a centering on veganism for sure, but I think it's a question of who do you allow to participate in those things and how you let people participate in those things. Currently, we have, organizing and activism centered around guilting people into caring about animals, confronting people and being aggressive towards people about caring about animals. I just don't think that's the way it works. For me, I personally feel that, and I think Ronnie touched on this, is that you can make all the vegans you want, but it doesn't make them activists. But if you make activists for animals, I think there's a good chance you can end up making them vegans. And I think we see that now where you can get 5,000 people to line up at a veg fest for a vegan hamburger. You can't get 5 people to line up outside of a fur store. And why is that? And that's because I think we've centered our activism around consumer-based and lifestyle changes. I think you see this a lot with younger people, younger vegans, and I was like this for a long time for sure as well. Activism becomes very ego-centered and very in my own head and in my own heart that I'm right and everyone else is wrong. And it's a lot of finger pointing and you're a terrible person, you're this, you're that. We have names for people that aren't like us, carnists and meat mouths and all this other stuff, and it's none of that is helpful to me. I mean, we've all said it, right? But also it's not helpful in creating people to be interested in what we believe in. But if you look at someone like, and I would argue some really big changes for animals in the world have all come from people that weren't vegan or vegetarian. I mean, we can look at whaling, for instance. The moratorium on whaling worldwide, where we protected and saved so many species from the brink of extinction, was people that ate animals. It's weird, but it's true. You see people in the US that are shutting down factory farming because they care about their health. They don't want to live in a house full of 1 million flies and live next to manure pits. They want to shut down factory farming. They're not vegan, but they're closing more factory farms than animal rights people are. I think there's a long list of things like that where we can say, like, here are people that care about animals and eat them too. Is that weird? Yes. How do we harness their power and make them into activists, and so that we can fight alongside one another to achieve the things we both want, but at the same time have those bigger conversations about, we also shouldn't be eating these animals. And I think you get to do both in pressure campaigning. It's not an either or. And so I would like to see a lot more of that forgiveness and humility in our movement, as opposed to finger pointing and name calling.
And Ronnie, on your side, the problem on your side of the argument is that people do orient towards veganism as a diet and a lifestyle and all that, and they're not educated to see the philosophy, are they? So isn't that going to always mean that that's going to be a deep problem? Only a minority of vegans become activists, but also only a minority of vegans understand the full meaning of veganism too, isn't it?
Well, I mean, not a question whether they were actually really vegans according to the definition, or just people that eat a plant diet, because veganism is a philosophy, it's not a diet. And I have a problem with where we hear people talk about their vegan journey. I kind of question that, because I think, well, there is no journey to veganism. Veganism is a philosophy that you either of being opposed to speciesism, being opposed to human supremacism, and wanting animal liberation. And you either accept that philosophy or you don't. There's not really a journey towards it. I think there's a journey within veganism. Once you accept that philosophy, there's a journey as to what you can do to live according to it. And we're finding out all the time different ways in which animals are oppressed and trying to avoid it and trying to campaign against it. There's that. But I think going back, it's kind of interesting, because the kind of scenario that Jake is sort of setting out is kind of very similar to the situation, I would say, maybe in the 1970s and 80s, where because I think the what I'd call the animal protection movement, I wouldn't call it the animal liberation movement because it hasn't always been an animal liberation movement, but the animal protection movement has kind of gone through 3 stages, I think. For many years up to the 1970s, there were mainly national organisations. I mean, I'm referring to the UK. It may be a bit different in other countries, but I mean, it probably is quite similar everywhere. Up until the 1970s, there were national organisations that campaigned against various forms of abuse of animals, cruelty to animals. You had National Anti-Vivisection Society, League Against Cruel Sports. There were organisations against the fur trade and all these things. And I don't think hardly any, if any, of the people involved in those organisations were vegan, and most of them weren't even vegetarian. And it wasn't considered, campaigning for veganism was not considered at all. Was not considered. These organisations campaigned on these what you'd call single issue areas. And then when the rise of the animal rights movement really in the 1970s saw a lot more younger people becoming involved, more action taking place. It was grassroots activity like the Hunt Saboteurs. There was the Animal Liberation Front. There were lots of different campaigns, protests, demonstrations, organised at grassroots level. And a lot of people involved in those weren't vegan. And I was involved in the Hunt Saboteurs group in North London, and the 2 or 3 of us that ran the group, we were vegan. But when people joined, they weren't vegan. They wanted to help to save the fox, or save the it was otter hunting at the time. They wanted to save the otter. They became, and most of them did become vegan through contact with us, because a lot of them weren't interested in veganism to start with. They vowed they would never go vegan, but within a couple of weeks, probably most of them did through us talking to them about it.
But that point, Ronnie, that's actually Jake's point, right? That you can get them in.
Jake's point, but end of conversation. That's it.
Yeah. What I want to do, yeah, that is Jake's point. But like yourself, wanted to kind of go forward from that. You see, the situation in those days was there was campaigning on all these issues: the fur trade, animal experimentation, factory farming, hunting and zoos and circuses, all these things. And what's had happened? More and more people involved in those campaigns were vegan, because the vegans in those campaigns converted the other people. So yes, those campaigns were a kind of a good way of converting people to veganism. But there was no campaigning for veganism. There was no vegan campaign. The vegan campaigning really is only, in any real sense, I think has only been going for about 20 years, certainly in the UK. But the point is that why was there no vegan campaigning? Why was there no vegan campaigning? I kind of think it was because people thought that was perhaps too big an issue to tackle, because like it is a huge area. I mean, if you look at all those campaigns, the one in the UK that involves the biggest slaughter of animals would be animal experimentation. And animal experimentation now in the UK is about, according to official figures anyway, 4 million animals a year. All right. The number of animals killed to feed people in the UK is 8 billion. It's a differential of 2,000 times. 2,000 times. So it seems crazy to me. Why was there kind of no campaigning against by far the biggest issue of animal oppression compared with the others? And I mean, I think that, you know, as I said, the environment's a big thing, and it's kind of something that's only more recently been recognised as a vegan issue, and that's huge as well. But the difference between the things that people normally campaign about, you know, the different or things that people normally considered between the consumption of animals and animal experimentation, the next one down, it's a 2,000 times differential. So, and we can't ignore that. You know, we have to campaign and have to put a lot of resources into the area, which involves the greatest oppression of animals, and which also changes people's attitudes at a fundamental level. Because if you want to make people anti-speciesist, you know, if you want to educate people to oppose human supremacism, then you need to educate them to go vegan. And if people are going to campaign against the biggest area of animal oppression, then it's ludicrous that those people themselves would be involved in it. That somebody would be campaigning outside a slaughterhouse while they still ate meat, or outside a big dairy complex while they still drank milk. So that really people have to go vegan first before they campaign against that, and that is the biggest area of animal oppression.
Jake?
Well, I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention. No, I'm just kidding. I think
you dropped off most of it. I know.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts about that. I think to speak a little bit to the last part there. Yeah, it is ludicrous to have people campaigning against these things that are also participating in them. But I also think that's how you build movements. I think that, like, the idea that we have to have a movement of purity before we can have a movement of mass mobilization is what holds us back. I don't know. I just don't think we will ever see the numbers of vegans over, you know, plant-based and so forth and so on. But the idea of, like, a vegan, someone that believes in animal liberation and is all in on that philosophy, I just don't think we'll ever have those numbers and those abilities to build a movement that can put enough pressure on Animal Ag to stop it. Like I said, there are already people that are putting pressure on animal agriculture and winning, but they're not vegan. And so, like, do we want to win, or do we want to win in the way that we want to win? And I think that's an important conversation. Like, do we want to shut down animal agriculture, or do we want to make vegans that shut down animal agriculture? Or can we do both? And I would argue that I think we can do both. I think we can allow people to fight for things that they believe in, even if their politics aren't 100% on board. The same way that, like, in the hunt saboteurs, you'd have people that were eating animals, but also trying to save them at the same time. But I think you, like you said, you bring those people along for the ride. You meet them where they're at politically and elevate them in a way that's compassionate and thoughtful and educational, as opposed to judgmental. And I think you bring those people along. I think there's something to be said for recognizing the strength of your movement. I obviously, you know way better than I do about what was going on back in the days of Neves and BUAV and hunt saboteurs and things like that. But I think there is something to be said for like scaling up your campaigning and scaling up your movement. And I think that's like, I think the breeder campaigns and the shack campaign is a great example of that, starting out small with Consort and Hillgrove, Regal Rabbits, you know, things like that, until you reach a mobilization of your movement and an upscaling of it, where you can be like, cool, now let's take on one of the world's largest contract research organizations. And I think like the same can be done for animal ag. Like you can be like, all right, we want to scale up our movement where we can take on the biggest corporations in the world that are killing billions of animals. But how do we get there? Do we start there, or do we grow our movement towards there? And it's like the long game, and the long game is frustrating and it's miserable. But I also think there's something to be said for strategically playing the long game with the hopes of winning down the road.
Well, if I can just jump in for a second, the one issue for me, because you both talked about numbers, right? And one issue is Tom Reagan's revolving door. Tom Reagan was always worried about the fact that we seemed to be able to recruit people into the vegan movement, but there's a lot of people we never retained, and it seemed to me that that's the kind of issue that we need to kind of address. So we might be able to get sufficient numbers and sufficient numbers of vegans. You know, if have I gone?
We can hear you, but your video's paused.
There we're back.
You're moving again now.
Yeah. Don't know what happened there. Yeah. I can eat like that as well.
Yeah.
Just as a kind of side issue, you know, how do we retain the vegans that we get? I mean, I know there's like wheels within wheels here, isn't there? Because we can get vegans, but then we can't get them to be activists, and then we can get activists and we can't get them to be organizers. But also we can get vegans, and a lot of them don't stay vegan. You know, I mean, one point that is very common in Jake's videos is pointing out the fact that we remain a small, you know, as a minute part of the population. We don't seem to be growing, even in this kind of like last half decade. You know, we don't seem to be kind of like, you know, really kind of growing. And that indicates that the revolving door is still happening, that we're losing a lot as well. So what's going on? You know, why are we losing? I mean, I got my own things, but what do you think? Anyway,
I'm happy to go first. Okay, yeah, I'll go.
One of you guys.
Yeah, the study's a little bit old at this point, but there's a study, I think it's from 2014 by Faunal It, and it's a US-based study, so I take that for what it's worth. But they polled 12,000 vegans, vegetarians, and former vegans and vegetarians, and asked them all sorts of questions. And it's a really interesting study, and I think it's the biggest and most comprehensive of its kind. But what they found is most people went vegan or plant-based for health and environmental reasons. And majority of people that switched and then went away within a year. So take that for what it's worth. But statistically speaking, we get people for about a year. And they also asked why people, you know, shifted away from veganism or plant-based eating. And the predominant answer was that it was difficult and it felt weird. The community felt weird, and I didn't like being a part of it. Why do I think people stop being activists, though, I think is a different question. And for me, the answer is that people like to win. And I think we all like to win. We all want to win as fast as we can. And I think when we are in a situation where we revolve our activism around how many vegans we have in our population, that's constantly a losing battle, because statistically nothing's really changed in terms of the percentage of the population. We hover around 1 to 3% vegan population. And to be frank, that's plant-based population. If we're really going to go by like veganism as in the philosophy of veganism and animal liberation, we're probably a fraction of a percentage of that 1 to 3%, if we're going to be honest. So I think, people that do strictly vegan outreach as a sole strategy for years and years and are like, fuck, like nothing's changed. We're at the same amount of people. Like, what am I doing with my time? And so people leave. I think people stick around when they feel like they're changing the world. And I think that's the other beautiful thing potentially about pressure campaigning. And I think that's to a certain extent, like Shaq, for instance, was as successful as it was, is because there's so many companies that were dropping out. People like that feeling of winning. Obviously, when the Shaq campaign came to an end, like that was a different feeling. But people liked going along on that ride because people liked winning. And I don't think there's a big sense of winning in a strategy of vegan outreach.
Yeah, Ronnie,
Yeah,
do you want to add to that?
I think Jake's kind of right about vegan outreach. There isn't that immediate feedback you get from if you have a campaign and a place closes because of that campaign. Yeah, there is a sense of winning, and I think that does encourage people. Vegan outreach isn't like that. I mean, yeah, I do sometimes hear back from people that have gone vegan because I've spoken to them and because I've given them some information. But most people that where that happens, mostly you kind of don't hear. So, yes, I recognise that is a problem. But of course, the other problem with pressure campaigning is the state, isn't it? I mean, what happened with Shaq? In the end, the state crushed Shaq because Shaq became probably too successful, and they were worried. And I think they were worried about a domino effect. I don't think they were particularly worried about Huntington Life Sciences because that was quite small in terms of the whole of the kind of vivisection industry, so to speak. But I think they worried about the domino effect, that once HLS went, who was next, and would they go, and the next one, and the next one, and so that the governments in both in the UK and the USA and elsewhere, took draconian action really, and I think that kind of is the problem with pressure campaigning. That what will happen is as soon as it becomes too successful, the state will intervene. Because of the nature of the state, if you've got a government that supports big business and supports big pharma, then they're going to do that. It's inevitable that they're going to support their mates, and they're going to take action, whatever type of whatever the target. If it's a target that involves big business, and all these things do, and so really you've got in order to prevent that, you've actually got to change the nature of. You've got to change the political system. So is it like that? So it's a political system that doesn't support big business, and then that won't happen because it always will. And this is the problem. And the Animal Liberation Front had exactly the same problem. As soon as the state caught on to caught up with the ALF, started realising that the ALF were a threat, and the ALF, was a danger to big business, then they brought in all sorts of measures, started creating special police squads. People were getting longer sentences. They took much more effort into catching people. They used laws that hadn't been used very much, like up until then, like conspiracy to convict people, all these things. And so that's the problem. That is a problem that pressure campaigning has got. That kind of vegan education hasn't, because it's kind of been really difficult to kind of bring in measures to arrest people for, doing a stall in the street or giving out food samples. So that's kind of it's pretty safe from that kind of state action. And I think in terms of, yes, I mean, I think if people are vegan for health or environmental reasons, there's more of a chance of them dropping out. I think if people are vegan for animal liberation reasons, there's less of a chance of let's say, I'm not sure people can be vegan for health or environmental reasons anyway, because veganism is a philosophy of animal liberation. But people that eat a plant diet for those reasons and then stop, because it's not such a strong deeply held belief that they have. I think that's
well, there is some research that backs that up, Ronnie. There is research that we do have, and it was reported by the Vegan RD. That was saying that if you're a vegan for ethical reasons, you tend to stay vegan. But Jake, you've obviously thought about this, and you advocate for the return of some forms. So obviously, you're probably kind of alive to the idea that if we just repeat what we did in the ALF, if we just repeat what we did in Shack, that's going to be a problem because we're going to end up in jail again. So, I mean, which bits of pressure campaign do you favor? I mean, we talk about home visits. I mean, do you have a list of the ones that we can do now and a list of the ones that we shouldn't do now, as it were?
I think we do what's effective for that particular campaign, and what's not effective, we don't do. It's trial by error, trial by fire. I have so many different directions I'd want to go in this, but first of all, I think that if we are trying to create animal liberation, that's not like a nice thing. That's not like a nicety that we get to ask for. The fact of the matter is, there's going to be people that are going to have to go to prison. And get in trouble and so forth and so on. I certainly don't advocate for that stuff, and I don't want that to happen. But if we were trying to change literally every fabric in society, this isn't a hobby that we do on the weekends. There's going to be consequences to some of the actions that some people take. Secondly, I think that I think there's a misunderstanding, and certainly not from either of you, but I think there's a broader misunderstanding in the animal rights movement that corporate campaigning, pressure campaigning, either is very welfarist, we're asking for bigger cages, or it's super radical like the ALF or Shack. But I think there is a nuance that falls in between those things. You can do corporate campaigning that's aggressive and wants big change without getting into a lot of trouble or without being shut down by the state in certain regards. And I think we see that a lot in other movements. I think the civil rights movement in the United States in the 50s, 60s, and 70s is a great example of that. I think the environmental movement and the climate justice movement currently is a good example of that. We see pressure campaigns going on all the time against banks, same way that we did them with Shack. Not a lot of the direct action stuff, but there's home demonstrations, there's targeting of the CEOs, upper management, there's petitions, emails, protests, educational outreach events, all that stuff. And it's starting to put a dent in things for instance, coal mining, coal production in the United States has dropped off and continues to drop off because there's been such a push against the banks to stop financing those fossil fuel extraction projects. And it's working. I mean, we're not seeing a massive shift in the greenhouse gases and emissions and so forth and so on, but it's those steps along the road. And I think in the animal rights movement, we say, well, that's not good enough because it's not animal liberation. Everything else besides that is welfarist. But I think we as activists get to decide what those stepping stones look like. We're going to have to take steps towards these end goals. And so those steps can be welfarist, they can be based in rights, or they can be based in liberation. And I personally prefer the latter. But we get to decide that as campaigners, and we get to decide what that looks like for our campaigns.
Okay. Before we move on to what I think it might be the last thing, I just said, Jake, is pressure campaigning, is it expensive? Not in terms of people in jail, but in terms of money.
I mean, I like I've said, my heart's in the grassroots movement. I really am a firm believer in do-it-yourself activism. So Shack, for instance, I mean, we didn't have a exact budget, but for the U.S. chapter that ran over the entire United States, I think our yearly budget was $70,000. That's $30,000 or $40,000 less than what James Aspie or Joey Carbstrong gets in a Patreon a year. I mean, if you took a fraction of what those 3 or 4 people make for talking to people about veganism, you could run enormous pressure campaigns.
Yeah, well, this is my point. Except I'm not gonna think in terms of James Aspie and Carbstrong. I'm going to think in terms of the national groups, because it seems to me that we can have these two things together, and we can increase these two things. But there's a kind of financial barrier to it, which is the fact that all the money of the movement is either held up now in these kind of entrepreneurs, or the real power structures of the movement are still the national groups, which are incredibly wasteful. And it seems to me that if we have the grassroots properly funded, then we could see a massive increase in vegan education like Ronnie would want to see it. So in other words, we could have local groups everywhere, not just the cities, have them everywhere, these little kind of vegan kind of events everywhere, the not the Veg Fest particularly, but you could have the big Veg Fest, but then you'd have the little vegan fairs all over the place. You'd have people out on the street, they'd be producing their own leaflets because they could afford to, and everything else like that. And then on the pressure campaign, you could have a big increase in that because you'd have enough money to mobilize. And it seems to me that if we could create a revolution within the movement, we can maybe create a revolution in the world, because the movement has all its money tied up in the least effective stuff, which is all kind of duplicated. I mean, I know, Ronnie, you kind of like quite supportive of some of the national groups, at least. I think that most of them in the internet age could just go now, because we need the emphasis to be on the grassroots, whether that is pressure campaign and whether that is vegan education. And I don't see why, with a properly funded movement, we couldn't have both, and a big increase in both. That seems to me to be where it's at, that there can be a marriage between your two positions. At the same time, I think it needs to be a funded thing where we can really see a massive increase in both.
There's a couple of things I'd say to that. I think the thing is that people tend to do what they feel most drawn to. If we had more activists, we'd have more of both, because some people would feel drawn to doing the education and some people would be drawn to do the pressure campaigning. So both would benefit if we had more activists, so we had more organisers. And the question is, how do we create that situation? Because kind of one difficulty I've experienced myself is in trying to get people active, to trying to get I mean, where I have the county where I live in England, we have locally a very active vegan group. We do loads of stuff. Obviously, we've been stopped now. We've gone over to social media advertising because of the coronavirus crisis. But normally we're out there doing a lot of stuff. But there are a few other towns in our county, and apart from one that has a moderately active vegan group, all the other towns don't have any groups. There's no activism there at all. And I've tried to kind of get activism going in those areas myself, and it's been really, really difficult. And I've come to the conclusion that a much more hands-on approach would be needed to set up groups there. Whether those groups were doing vegan education or whether they were doing pressure campaign, whatever they were doing, there'd need to be a much more hands-on approach to set those groups up. And in order to do that, you'd have to have kind of people full-time working on that. And so how would those people be financed? They'd have to do it as a job. They're doing it full time, and so where would their wages come from? And of course, all the money in the movement is held within the national societies. So yes, if we could have a situation where all that money got taken away from the national societies, or a lot of it, and put into funding regional organisers to get these things going, that would be great. But it's a question of kind of how do we do that? Is there a way we can do that? I mean, what I've been saying is that I'd like to see the national societies come together and to form an organisation that would actually use some of their resources to employ those people. That's what I've been saying, because I can't. How are we going to do it? How are we going to get the money away from them into something else so these people can be employed? I don't really know.
Do you want to say anything about that, Jake?
Sure. I'd love to just keep. I think.
Can we stop? Can we stop you saying anything about that, Jake?
Absolutely not. I think I agree with all that. Like, I think there's this weird idea that like people shouldn't get paid for activism and that it's like a terrible thing. And I would strongly encourage the opposite. Like, the more people you can put on a payroll to like do activism, the better off we're going to be. To that end, I think the money to at least start things like that is there in the grassroots animal rights movement. People are just allocating it in the wrong places. I don't think we need someone making $130,000 to sit on a street corner and say, fight me about the dairy industry or prove I'm wrong. You need $130,000 to employ 4 people in 4 counties to go and start doing vegan outreach, for instance, or organizing a pressure campaign. I think the money's there. I think the national organizations are interesting because I think a lot of people think that like they're separate from grassroots movements. But I think at the end of the day, those national groups rely on the grassroots movement to do their dirty work. Like we are their boots on the ground. And so when they need a protest, when they need a petition, when they need an action, they come to the grassroots. And
it's always been the same.
Right. It's been that way forever. And so I think that like we have a certain amount of power over those national organizations. But again, that also requires us to organize around that and be strategic and come together as a movement and say like, cool, yeah, we're happy to help the nationals out, but you need to start helping us out too. And you need to start employing us independently or contract us or whatever it is to do this type of work. So I think there's ideas and options there.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, I see it as a structural problem, and it's almost like it would solve this conversation that we're having. It seems to me, because the wrong people. Well, that's the wrong thing to say, but the money is not getting to where it needs to be. I mean, like now, you know, you've had years and years and years of these non-profits who become rich, and then they all duplicate each other. And now you've got this kind of little group of people who are using the movement to make a name for themselves in a way that us three probably never even thought about it. I certainly never thought that. I mean, Ronnie Lee, right? With your CV, you could have been rich and famous, but you never thought about it in the way that Carbstrong has, presumably, or James Aspey, because it just never crossed our mind. And I've always said that, you know, there are some people who see a problem and then they see their cause, and other people see a problem and then they see their career. And it seems to me that if we can fund the people who are focused on the cause, then they're not going to take a lot of money. You know, I mean, if I had a ton of money, it'd go to the cause. You know, you just need a fraction enough, you know, kind of minimum wage or whatever, you know, that kind of thing. You know, I always used to say when people used to argue with as well, you know, I don't mind people having a wage, you know, as long as it's the smallest that they can live on. And then you'd expect them to do 120 hours or something, you know. But I mean, the wage bit is not the problem for me. It's the fact that, you know, people seem to, you know. I mean, I remember the frustration of people in Ireland trying to get through to some of the national groups in England when that was the model that they used to follow, and they couldn't get through. You know, by the time it was 4:30, they'd all gone. You know, they'd left the office, kind of thing. Whereas you can usually ring up somebody in the grassroots at 3 o'clock in the morning, you know, and you've got a problem, and they're there. It's a different mentality, I think. But that kind of activist mentality has never been really funded. That's what I kind of think. Anyway, it's just, I mean, I know it's a bit of a bugbear of mine, but that's certainly, I think it's part of the solution to what you two are both talking to as well.
Yeah, I think it is. I think you've got to. You've got to kind of seed these groups, these active groups, and you've got to have someone there to do it, and that person has to be paid to do it as a job in order for it to work. And it's a question of like, where do we get the money from to fund that, and how do we divert the money from where it is now to that? And it's you know, what do we do? Do we set up an organisation to do that, or do we hope that we can persuade the national organisations or, you know, some of these rich vegan celebs to put money into it? It's just a question of like the practicalities of setting it up and creating it, really.
Well, didn't you both, or one of you, take over the BUAV office at some point to do a press office or supporters group? How'd that work out?
It wasn't a takeover.
No, they allowed us. They allowed the ALF to have they had a new. They moved into a new office suite and they had more room than they needed. So one side of their office suite they allocated to various groups. There was the ALF press office. There's the Fur Action Group was in there. I think Sea Shepherd had or the local Sea Shepherd had a desk in there, and that was okay until it kind of went sour and we all got thrown out in the end. But yeah,
we won't go into the reason for that, will we, Ronnie?
We can read all about it somewhere, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But what created that environment though, where like a group like the BUAV or whatever was like, oh yeah, how like you all, the ALF Press Office and Supporters Group, can have office space in our office? Like, what created that environment?
What happened? There'd been the BUAV had been one of these traditional organisations that I mentioned earlier, where the people people that ran it weren't particularly radical, and basically they were just asking their supporters to send them money or write to their member of parliament. That was about what it amounted to. And then there was this rise in the animal rights movement during the 1970s, and that led to a lot of people becoming dissatisfied with how the BUAV operated, and they kind of staged a coup and took the BUAV over. So suddenly people running the BUAV were all these kind of radical activists. And
yeah, but that's the very point though, Ronnie, isn't it? The fact that it was the first time that relatively radical people had the funds, right?
Yes.
And I mean, I remember, when we walked into the BUAV, it was Charing Cross Road at the time, before Crane Grove. Yeah. When we walked in there the first time after we'd taken it over, right? We went to the stock cupboard, and there was like loads and loads of tea towels with Harrogate written on it. Harrogate is a town in the north of England. For some reason, they had Harrogate things. And then there's a pile of animal welfare books, and that was it, And so for the first time, this goes to my thesis really. For the first time, relatively radical people got some money, and then remember that there was the the fly posting campaign. One of the first things the BUAV did after being radicalized was to produce these massive this is vivisection fly posters. Remember those really huge things, right?
Yeah.
And and then I remember being in the office, and we were bundling them up, and we were sending them to anybody we could think of in a group anywhere in the country. And then suddenly they all went up there, and they were just everywhere suddenly, and it was the first time that people who were radicals, people who were campaigners, not careerists, the first time that they got some money and they put it to the campaign. It wasn't about becoming famous or becoming rich or becoming known. Obviously it was before social media and all that. So that's what kind of inspires my kind of ideas about the fact that, there is a financial element to this, which would go a long way to solving what you're both talking about, I think.
I think that's true. I mean, sadly, with the BUAV, we had the kind of animal farm type situation where it eventually became less radical.
Well, yeah.
For various reasons, and that was, that wouldn't necessarily happen with the
No, I'm one event there was we were both in prison together, and we learned that they'd been fined 30,000 quid or something because they'd said something or done something to Boots, the chemist, the vivisector, right? And you said to me, well, what the BUAV need to do is just close down, right? They just need to close down so they don't pay the fine, and then they start again as something else, in a few weeks' time. And of course they wouldn't do that, Oh no, it's the BUAV, kind of, well, fuck the BUAV. The name didn't matter.
No,
I remember you saying, Ronnie, you said, well, look, if it helped the movement, we will just scrap the name Animal Liberation Front in 2 seconds.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. But there we are. But that doesn't mean. We're talking about kind of something different, aren't we? We're talking about something that's probably even more grassroots than that, because the BUAV didn't have local campaigning in the sense that we're talking about. In terms, there are people in local areas that did things, but it's not like local groups that did things at grassroots level. That's what we're talking about, and getting those groups set up and funding people to stimulate those groups. That's what we need. That would be a huge leap forward for the movement if that could be achieved.
And is there any of that in the States? Is there any possibility of that kind of thing in the States, Jake?
People funding grassroots organizations and people to engage in that type of activity?
Yeah, put in a big, being, rather than the big kind of transnational corporations, the real focus on the grassroots, out of which can grow pressure campaigning and vegan education all over the place.
I think that happens now to a certain extent. I don't know. I think the grassroots movement in the United States is a little blurry on what's grassroots and what's not. I think a lot of like after Shaq and onward, I think there was a big push for grassroots groups to become professional and wear suits and ties and get a big budget and stuff like that. And I think part of the issue is when you get more money, the more you are beholden to donors, and the more you are beholden to donors, the less grassroots you are and the less radical you are in your politics and your goals change. But I think, when I first started in the 90s, there definitely was like a strong radical grassroots movement in the United States and elsewhere that had like wealthy people that were involved in it. And they weren't like, wealthy people dishing out money, but it was like, oh, we want to like buy a car to like block a street or something. And go ask this person or this person and they'll shoot you $1,000 and let you buy a car and pop the tires and lock down to it type of thing. So like there was stuff like that happening. But I don't know if there was like something centralized and official. And to a certain regards, at that time anyways, that probably wouldn't have been a very good idea legally speaking. But yeah, I do recall like groups like In Defense of Animals, for instance, who were, regardless of how you feel about them now or then, but they were a rather larger national organization in the US, and they were always down to fund grassroots activism. We want to do a lockdown, we want to do a sit-in, we want to do this. Cool, well, here's a bunch of money, here's our offices, use whatever you need. They also took credit for all of it, but
that's
a whole other story.
That was the payoff, wasn't it? Kind of like, you get the stuff and we'll use it. But also it was a kind of like, if you knew somebody, you can get the old backhander kind of thing. But it wasn't it wasn't a structured funding, was it? It was kind of like you had to know somebody, and they gave you a few crumbs from the top table,
But that was the big thing with Shaq too in the investigation. They wanted to know where was all this money coming from, who was funding it, so that they could go after them. I mean, the fact of the matter was, it was just we were doing stalls on the street corner the same way that a lot of y'all were doing there. But and that was something they couldn't wrap their heads around. Well, surely you have like large groups and rich people giving you money. It's like, no, we're just literally begging for it on the street corner. So I do think that like there is a gray area there where you start setting up something to finance more radical activities, whether that's vegan outreach or pressure campaigns. And I do think that draws attention.
So, well, folks, have we reached a solution here to the question? How to achieve?
Absolutely. What do we work on next?
It only took an hour.
We should have done this like 10 years ago. We would have been.
I mean, do you think that really we could? I mean, like the final question is: can these two ideas live together and really both flourish at the same time? I think yeah.
I think they have to. I think it's essential in order to win.
Yeah, we're all nodding here, folks. So
I'm going to take this one.
We're all nodding. Right. Well, we've achieved animal liberation, so I reckon our job is done. Because
I have a question.
Oh.
Yeah, and you're not required to answer.
Oh, all right.
Is there a short story you could tell that involves the two of you getting in trouble together at some point?
No, we didn't do any actions together, if that's what you mean. We got into trouble in the prison. Enough time. Ronnie, do you want to tell the story about the pigeon?
Yeah, you probably remember it better, Roger, because you're younger.
I probably do. Yeah.
So you tell it.
Yeah. So we're on exercise, and we noticed a injured pigeon who seemed to be in some distress, and I think we might have waited to the next day, and I remember Ronnie kind of toddling over and picking her up, and putting her under his coat kind of thing. And so we were sharing a cell at the time. So the pigeon ended up back in the cell, and then I don't know how, we managed to get a box, and so we made a little home for the pigeon. And then of course one of the screws discovered the bird, And of course, this is, you know, you can't have that vermin in the cell type of thing. And so then we had a
So you got thrown out.
Sorry. It took me a while, you horrible thing.
And that's how Roger got early release.
Yeah, that's right. So I flew off, and
Yeah.
and so I remember, you know, like not the governor, but you know, one of the deputy governor, they called vice governors or something. I can't quite remember, Ronnie, but some
governor. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
some
the
guy came. Some guy came, and you basically said, "Look, you know, we want you. We'll kind of relinquish the bird, but we want you to make sure that the bird ends up in a sanctuary. Otherwise, there's going to be trouble," kind of thing. So you effectively kind of threatened them, really, with with a bit of kind of trouble. They would get a lot of bad press and all the rest of it. And you know, if they did comply, and they kind of said that they would, because we didn't know whether they did or not. And so obviously we didn't have a lot of say in it, really, to be honest. I mean, they could have just, you know, so we kind of took that as being the best deal we could get.
Yeah.
And then they trooped off with the box, and of course we never saw her again. But we're hoping that you know, she ended up in a sanctuary, but we don't know for sure.
Yeah.
So
You just got to hope. You're kind of limited in what you can do in those places, obviously.
Yeah, the idea of the two of you in a cell together for however long that was sounds insane.
It was a nightmare. It was to.
yeah. Yeah, I remember Ronnie telling me that if your farts were loud, they didn't smell as much. Do you remember that, Ronnie?
Probably, yeah. It's the sort of thing I'd say, yeah. That's an excuse for my farts, though, probably.
Well, this is it. Yeah.
Well, that took a turn.
Yeah. Actually, the weird thing, though, on a kind of more serious note about that, your experience of prison wasn't great, was it, to Jake?
Because, no, it was a little different.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a different system, really, aren't we? Because, you know, I mean, like some British activists, unfortunately, they kind of describe prison as a holiday camp, nothing to be afraid of. But you know, you wouldn't have gone with that.
I mean, everyone has different experiences in different situations at different times, and you know, wasn't my experience. I would have loved to have been not loved to have been in a cell with the two of you, but it would have made things more interesting for sure.
Yeah. I always think I must have been lucky because it wasn't too bad for me, and I kind of fitted in. You know, they obviously didn't see me as a con like them, so they saw me as a political prisoner, really. But they didn't quite understand, you know. I mean, they were very practical. For example, we were talking about the vivisection campaigns, and they said, well, you know, why are you messing around? Just grab a vivisector, tie him to a tree, and break his hands with baseball bats. They were really very practical about it, you know.
Very straightforward, yeah.
Yeah, and we were going. Oh, you can't do that, you know. And and I don't know whether Ronnie remember this.
Them, shouldn't we? Should have recruited them.
Yeah, do you remember, Ronnie? There was a guy who was a badger baiter, and he was talking about how dangerous badgers were and all that. And I gave him a copy of The Guardian one time, and I said, have a look in that because some badgers have just developed a nuclear weapon. And he goes, well, there you are then. You know, they are dangerous. So yeah, I don't know. We better not make this into a prison anecdote show.
Better not. No, we'll go on forever. Right?
That's going to be part 2, I suppose. Well, look, thanks very much for taking part in this, and I think we came to some kind of consensus, knock some ideas around, which is pretty good. So thanks again to my special guests for today, Jake Conroy and Ronnie Lee. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks so much for having me.
Cheers, Jake.
Thank you, Ronnie.